The morning sun cast long shadows across the grounds of Arlington National Cemetery as visitors began their quiet pilgrimage through history. Among them walked a small figure whose presence would soon capture hearts across the nation. His name was Ethan, a 7-year-old boy with sandy hair that refused to stay combed and eyes that sparkled with an uncommon depth of understanding for someone so young. Ethan's family had traveled from a small town in Ohio to pay respects to his great-grandfather, a veteran who had served during World War II. The old man had passed away just 3 months earlier, and Ethan had been closer to him than anyone else in the family. They had spent countless afternoons together, the elderly veteran sharing stories of brotherhood, sacrifice, and duty while young Ethan listened with rapt attention, absorbing every word like a sponge. His mother, Sarah, held his hand gently as they walked through the rows of white marble headstones. She noticed how quietly he moved, how carefully he stepped, as if aware that this was sacred ground. Unlike other children his age who might grow restless or distracted, Ethan seemed to understand the weight of where they stood. Each headstone represented a life, a story, a family left behind. They were making their way toward the tomb of the unknown soldier, a detour Sarah thought might help Ethan understand the broader meaning of service and sacrifice. She had explained to him the night before about the Sentinel who guards the tomb 24 hours a day, every day of the year, regardless of weather or circumstance. Ethan had asked questions that surprised her with their thoughtfulness. He wanted to know if the guard ever got lonely, if the soldier in the tomb knew someone was watching over him, if it made the families feel better knowing their loved one was never alone. As they approached the tomb, Ethan's grip on his mother's hand tightened slightly. The marble monument stood before them, gleaming white against the blue sky, and the Sentinel moved with precision that seemed almost supernatural. Each step measured exactly 21 inches, each turn executed with mechanical perfection, the click of his shoes on the mat the only sound breaking the profound silence. Ethan watched, transfixed. The other visitors stood behind the chains that marked the boundary, cameras ready, whispers exchanged. But the boy's attention never wavered from the Sentinel. He studied the way the guard held his rifle, the way his eyes remained fixed forward, the way he seemed to exist in a space between the living world and the realm of honor. Sarah felt her son's hand slip from hers. Before she could react, Ethan had moved forward, not toward the tomb itself, but positioning himself near the mat where the Sentinel paced. Her heart leaped into her throat as she started to reach for him, worried he might cross into the restricted area. But something in his bearing made her pause. The boy stood at attention. His small back straightened, his chin lifted, his arms pressed firmly to his sides. His feet came together in a way that suggested he had practiced this stance before, probably in his great-grandfather's living room, while the old veteran guided him with gentle corrections and proud smiles. Ethan's young voice, clear and strong despite its youth, began to recite words that made everyone within earshot freeze in their tracks. He was speaking the soldier's creed, something his great-grandfather had taught him during their last weeks together. The old man had made him promise to remember it, to understand what it meant to serve something greater than oneself. The words flowed from Ethan with a sincerity that adults spend lifetimes trying to capture. He spoke of duty and honor, of standing ready to deploy, engage, and destroy enemies of the United States of America. He spoke of being a guardian of freedom and the American way of life, an American soldier. His small voice carried across the sacred space, each word pronounced with careful respect. Visitors who had been preparing to move on found themselves rooted to the spot. Cameras were lowered. Whispers ceased entirely. Even the ever-present background noise of the city beyond the cemetery walls seemed to fade away. The world had narrowed to this one small boy, standing as tall as his young frame would allow, honoring not just his great-grandfather, but every soldier who had ever worn the uniform. Sarah's eyes filled with tears she hadn't expected. She recognized some of the words Ethan spoke as phrases her grandfather had repeated often, especially toward the end when he seemed to sense his time growing short. The old man had been teaching the boy more than words. He had been passing on a legacy, an understanding of service that transcended age and time. The Sentinel continued his march, his face an impassive mask as training and duty demanded. 21 steps down the mat, turn, face the tomb for 21 seconds, turn, 21 steps back. The ritual was unchanging, unbreakable, as constant as the North Star. But those watching noticed something unusual. As the guard passed near where Ethan stood, there was the slightest, almost imperceptible acknowledgement in his eyes, a flicker of something that suggested the young boy's tribute had not gone unnoticed. When Ethan finished reciting the creed, he brought his small hand up in a salute that his great-grandfather had taught him to perform correctly. The motion was crisp, his hand flat, fingers together, the edge of his hand cutting sharply above his eyebrow. He held it there for several seconds, his body trembling slightly with the effort of maintaining such perfect stillness. Then, something happened that would be talked about for years to come. The sentinel, in the middle of his sacred duty, in the midst of his precisely measured routine, did something that sentinels simply do not do. As he completed his 21 count facing the tomb and began his turn, his eyes moved just slightly. They found the small boy standing at attention, hand raised in salute. And then, so briefly that some witnesses would later question whether they had imagined it, the sentinel's hand moved. It was not a full salute, not a break in protocol, but a subtle acknowledgement, a gesture of respect from one guardian to another, from soldier to soldier, across generations and experience. The moment lasted only seconds, but its impact rippled through every person present. Some visitors openly wept, others stood with hands over hearts, overwhelmed by what they had witnessed. Sarah moved forward and gently placed her hand on Ethan's shoulder. He lowered his salute slowly, maintaining his stance for just a moment longer before relaxing and turning to look up at his mother, with eyes that somehow seemed older than they had been just minutes before. The crowd that had gathered around the tomb of the unknown soldier remained still, as if moving might somehow break the spell of what they had just witnessed. Among them was a retired Marine named Robert Chen, who had served 3 tours overseas and now worked as a high school history teacher. He had brought his phone out moments before Ethan had stepped forward, intending to capture the changing of the guard for his students. Instead, he had recorded something far more profound. Robert's hands shook slightly as he looked down at his phone screen, watching the playback. The footage was clear, the audio crisp. Every word Ethan had spoken was captured, along with the profound silence that had fallen over the crowd. And there, unmistakable in the video, was that moment when the sentinel had acknowledged the boy. Robert knew what this meant. He had stood watch himself, understood the sacred nature of the duty, the absolute commitment to protocol. What he had witnessed was extraordinary. Sarah gathered Ethan close, feeling the tension drain from his small body. Other visitors began to approach them, not crowding but moving closer with expressions of wonder and respect. An elderly woman with a Veterans of Foreign Wars pin on her jacket knelt down to Ethan's level, her weathered hands reaching out to gently touch his shoulder. Her eyes were bright with tears she made no effort to hide. The woman's voice was soft but firm when she spoke. She told Ethan that her husband had served in Vietnam and never came home. She explained that for 50 years she had wondered if anyone remembered him, if his sacrifice meant anything to anyone beyond their immediate family. Watching Ethan stand there, honoring all soldiers with such pure conviction, had given her an answer she had been seeking for half a century. Her husband's service mattered. It would always matter. Young people like Ethan would carry the memory forward. A middle-aged man in a business suit stepped forward next. His name was Marcus, and though he wore the uniform of corporate America now, the military bearing never quite left a person. He had served in the Army for 12 years, and his voice cracked slightly as he thanked Ethan for reminding him why he had served in the first place. Sometimes, he admitted, the years of civilian life made those memories feel distant, the purpose unclear, but watching a child understand and honor that commitment brought everything back into sharp focus. Sarah found herself surrounded by stories. Each person who approached shared something, a connection to service, a memory of someone who had worn the uniform. A young woman explained that her brother was currently deployed overseas, and she worried constantly about his safety. Seeing Ethan's tribute reminded her that her brother's choice to serve came from a place of honor and duty, not recklessness. Another visitor, an active duty soldier in uniform, simply shook Ethan's hand with a grip that was gentle but meaningful, a warrior's acknowledgement of shared understanding. Through it all, Ethan remained remarkably composed for a 7-year-old thrust into the center of adult emotions. He listened to each person, his eyes attentive, occasionally nodding. When the elderly woman with the VFW pin had finished speaking, Ethan had told her he was sorry about her husband, but he was sure the soldier was proud of her for remembering him all these years. The simple, honest words had made the woman sob with a mixture of grief and gratitude. Robert Chen approached Sarah, introducing himself and asking for permission to share the video he had recorded. He explained that he thought what Ethan had done was important, that people needed to see it, to be reminded of what service and sacrifice truly meant. Sarah felt torn. Part of her wanted to keep this moment private, sacred to their family. But another part recognized that Ethan's tribute belonged to something larger than them. She looked down at her son, asking him what he thought. Ethan considered the question with the same seriousness he brought to everything. After a moment, he said that his great-grandfather had always told him that honor should be shared, that remembering together made the memories stronger. If the video helped people remember soldiers and be grateful for them, then his great-grandfather would want it shared. By evening, Robert Chen had posted the video on several social media platforms, carefully crafting a caption that explained the context without sensationalizing the moment. He described Ethan's connection to his great-grandfather, the significance of the tomb of the unknown soldier, and the extraordinary acknowledgement from the Sentinel. He ended with a simple question: "When was the last time you thanked a veteran?" The response was immediate and overwhelming. Within hours, the video had been shared thousands of times. By the next morning, it had gone viral, spreading across the internet like wildfire. News outlets picked up the story, reaching out to Sarah for interviews. Veterans groups shared it with commentary about the importance of teaching younger generations about service and sacrifice. Parents showed it to their children as an example of respect and honor. The reactions varied but shared a common thread. Active military members commented about how the video reminded them why they served, especially during difficult deployments or challenging assignments. Veterans, some who had struggled with the transition to civilian life, found themselves moved to tears by a child's simple act of honor. Gold Star families, those who had lost loved ones in service, expressed gratitude that someone so young understood and valued their loss. There were critics, of course. Some accused Sarah of exploiting her child for attention. Others claimed the video was staged, that no 7-year-old could possibly understand what he was doing. A few argued that teaching children military creeds was inappropriate, that it militarized youth. But these voices were drowned out by the overwhelming positive response, by the thousands of people who saw in Ethan's actions something pure and necessary in a world that often felt cynical and disconnected. Sarah read through the comments late at night. After Ethan had gone to bed, she found messages from soldiers deployed in distant countries, thanking her son for reminding them that people back home cared. She read notes from teachers who planned to show the video to their classes as part of discussions about citizenship and service. She discovered stories from families who had been inspired to visit war memorials they had always meant to see, but never prioritized. One message in particular caught her attention. It came from a woman named Patricia, who explained that her teenage son had been going through a difficult time, feeling lost and purposeless. After watching Ethan's video, the boy had asked his mother about his grandfather's service in Korea, a topic the family rarely discussed. That conversation had led to the teenager requesting to visit the local VA hospital, to talk to veterans, to hear their stories. Patricia credited Ethan with opening a door that had been closed for too long. Upstairs in his room, Ethan slept peacefully, unaware of the waves his simple act had created. On his bedside table sat a photograph of his great-grandfather in uniform, young and proud, taken more than 70 years earlier. The old man smiled out from the frame, frozen in a moment of youth and possibility, before the wars and years had added lines to his face and weight to his shoulders. Sarah stood in the doorway of Ethan's room, watching him sleep. She thought about her grandfather, about the hours he had spent with Ethan, the lessons deliberately taught and accidentally absorbed. The old veteran had known his time was running short. In teaching Ethan about duty and honor, about service and sacrifice, he had been planting seeds for a future he would never see. Now those seeds were bearing fruit in ways none of them could have anticipated. 3 days after the video went viral, Sarah received a phone call that would change everything. The voice on the other end belonged to Colonel Martinez, the commander of the ceremonial unit responsible for guarding the tomb of the unknown soldier. His tone was formal but warm, and he explained that he wanted to personally thank Ethan for his tribute and invite the family to attend a special ceremony at Arlington. Sarah's first instinct was to decline. The attention had already been overwhelming, and she worried about exposing Ethan to more scrutiny. But the colonel was persuasive. He explained that Ethan's actions had resonated deeply within the military community, and they wanted to honor his understanding of service in a meaningful way. More importantly, he said, there were people Ethan should meet, veterans and active-duty soldiers who had been moved by his tribute and wanted to thank him personally. The ceremony was scheduled for the following week, giving Sarah time to prepare Ethan and make arrangements. The news of the event spread quickly through social media, and hundreds of people expressed interest in attending. The Army made provisions for the increased crowd, while maintaining the dignity and solemnity appropriate to the location. When the day arrived, Ethan wore his best clothes, a simple button-down shirt and slacks that his mother had pressed carefully the night before. As they drove through the cemetery gates, Ethan noticed American flags everywhere, more than he remembered from their first visit. Sarah explained that people had been leaving flags all week, inspired by his tribute, each one representing gratitude and remembrance. They were escorted to a special area near the tomb, where chairs had been set up for family members and distinguished guests. Ethan recognized some faces from the news, generals and politicians who had traveled to attend. But what caught his attention were the regular soldiers, standing in their dress uniforms, medals gleaming in the morning sun. There were young men and women who looked barely out of their teens, and weathered veterans who carried themselves with the weight of decades of service. Colonel Martinez approached them, his uniform immaculate, his bearing commanding yet approachable. He knelt down to Ethan's eye level, something that struck Sarah as remarkable given his rank and position. The colonel spoke directly to the boy, thanking him for his tribute and explaining that what Ethan had done mattered more than he might understand. The soldiers needed to know that their service was valued, that people remembered and cared. Ethan had reminded everyone of that truth. The ceremony began with the changing of the guard, performed with the same precision Ethan had witnessed before. But this time, after the new Sentinel had taken his post and the relieved guard had departed, something unprecedented happened. The colonel stepped forward and began to speak, his voice carrying across the assembled crowd. He talked about duty and honor, about the unbroken chain of service that stretched back to the founding of the nation. He spoke about sacrifice not just of those who had fallen, but of the families who supported them, the children who grew up missing parents, the spouses who held everything together during long deployments. Then the colonel called Ethan forward. Sarah felt her son's hand tighten around hers for just a moment, before he stood and walked to where the colonel waited. The boy's steps were measured and careful, his bearing straight despite the weight of hundreds of eyes upon him. When he reached the colonel, he stood at attention, just as he had done the week before. Colonel Martinez presented Ethan with a folded American flag, explaining that it had flown over the tomb of the unknown soldier. The flag was surprisingly heavy in Ethan's small arms, the weight of the fabric somehow carrying the weight of all it represented. The colonel told him that this flag was a gift from the old guard, the unit responsible for guarding the tomb, in recognition of his tribute and his understanding of what their mission meant. But there was more. The colonel explained that inside the flag was a special certificate, signed by every member of the current relief, the soldiers who currently stood watch over the tomb. Each signature represented a personal thank you, an acknowledgement from guardian to guardian. Ethan's eyes widened as he clutched the flag tighter, seeming to understand the magnitude of what he held. The colonel stepped back and saluted Ethan, a crisp, perfect salute that the boy returned with all the precision his great-grandfather had taught him. The crowd erupted in applause, but it was different from ordinary applause. It was thunderous yet somehow controlled, powerful yet respectful. Many in attendance were crying openly, not from sadness but from the overwhelming emotion of witnessing something that connected past, present, and future in a single moment. After the ceremony, Ethan found himself surrounded by veterans who had traveled from across the country to meet him. There was James, a Vietnam veteran who had struggled for decades with PTSD and survivor's guilt. He told Ethan that watching the video had been the first time in 50 years that he had felt proud of his service, rather than ashamed he had survived when others had not. He explained that seeing a child honor all soldiers without judgment or politics had helped him begin to heal wounds he thought would never close. Another veteran, a woman named Maria who had served in Iraq, described how Ethan's tribute had helped her teenage daughter understand why Maria still woke up with nightmares sometimes, why certain sounds made her jumpy, why she took her service so seriously. The daughter had been embarrassed by her mother's reactions before, seeing them as weakness. Now she understood they came from the weight of carrying responsibility for others, of seeing things that changed you forever. Ethan had helped bridge a gap that Maria had struggled to cross alone. There were younger soldiers too, some who had just completed basic training. They told Ethan that during difficult moments in their training, when everything hurt and quitting seemed easier than continuing, they had thought about his video. If a 7-year-old could understand the importance of their mission, if a child could inspire so many people to remember and honor service, then their decision to serve mattered. His tribute had become a touchstone for them, a reminder of why they had raised their right hand and sworn an oath. Throughout the afternoon, Ethan listened to story after story. He heard from Gold Star mothers who had lost sons and daughters in service, from wounded warriors who bore visible and invisible scars, from active duty soldiers facing upcoming deployments. Each person shared how his simple act of honor had touched them, had reminded them that their sacrifices were seen and valued. One encounter particularly moved Sarah. An elderly man approached them late in the afternoon, moving slowly with the aid of a walker. He introduced himself as Thomas, a World War II veteran who had served alongside Ethan's great-grandfather. The two men had been in the same unit, had fought in the same battles, had shared the bond that only combat could forge. Thomas explained that he had seen the video and recognized the words Ethan recited. The same words his old friend had lived by for more than 7 decades. Thomas reached into his jacket and pulled out a photograph, yellowed with age but carefully preserved. It showed 2 young soldiers barely out of their teens, standing side by side in muddy uniforms, exhaustion evident on their faces but determination in their eyes. Thomas pointed to one of the soldiers, identifying him as Ethan's great-grandfather. The other soldier was Thomas himself, decades younger but recognizable in the set of his jaw and the steadiness of his gaze. He told Ethan that his great-grandfather had been the best man he had ever known, brave without being reckless, compassionate without being weak, honorable in every action. Thomas explained that near the end of the war, Ethan's great-grandfather had saved his life, pulling him from a burning vehicle while under fire. He had never forgotten that debt, had never stopped being grateful for the chance to live his life, marry his wife, raise his children, and eventually meet his grandchildren. All of it was possible because a young soldier had valued his life more than his own safety. Thomas pressed the photograph into Ethan's hand, telling him to keep it. He wanted the boy to have a tangible connection to who his great-grandfather had been, not just in the stories and lessons, but in those crucial moments when character was tested and proven true. The old veteran's voice broke as he added that seeing Ethan honor all soldiers, including his old friend, had brought him a peace he had not known he was seeking. His friend's legacy lived on, not just in stories but in the values he had instilled in his great-grandson. The weeks following the ceremony brought changes to Ethan's life that none of them could have anticipated. Schools across the country began reaching out, requesting visits or video messages. Veterans organizations invited him to speak at their events. Media outlets wanted interviews. Sarah found herself carefully navigating these requests, trying to balance letting Ethan's message reach people who needed to hear it while protecting his childhood from being consumed by attention. She established clear boundaries. Ethan would only participate in events that felt meaningful and age-appropriate. No commercial endorsements, no political events, no situations that felt exploitative. Most importantly, his schooling and normal childhood activities took priority over everything else. She watched him carefully for signs of stress or discomfort, ready to pull back if the attention became too much. But what surprised Sarah most was how naturally Ethan seemed to handle everything. He had not sought attention or glory. His tribute at the tomb had been genuine, born from love for his great-grandfather and respect for all who served. That authenticity carried through in every subsequent interaction. When he spoke to veterans groups, his words were simple and sincere. When he visited schools, he talked about his great-grandfather's stories and lessons without trying to sound older or more important than he was. Children his age understood him because he remained one of them, just a kid who loved his family and wanted to honor their memory. One invitation stood out among all the others. The principal of a school in inner-city Detroit had written to Sarah, explaining that his students came from difficult backgrounds where military service was often seen as a last resort, rather than an honorable choice. Many had family members who had served but never talked about it, their experiences locked away behind walls of trauma and silence. He believed Ethan could help open conversations that these families desperately needed to have. Sarah discussed the invitation with Ethan, and they decided to accept. The trip to Detroit became a turning point, revealing the broader impact of what had begun at Arlington. The school was older, its resources limited, but the students' curiosity and intelligence were evident from the moment Ethan arrived. They had watched his video in class and prepared questions that demonstrated real thought and engagement. During an assembly, Ethan stood on stage with a microphone that was almost too big for him. He talked about his great-grandfather, about the afternoons they spent together, about learning to salute properly and understanding what the flag represented. He explained that his great-grandfather had told him that serving your country was about protecting the people you loved and the values you believed in. It was not about violence or glory, but about standing up when standing up was hard, about taking responsibility for others, about being part of something bigger than yourself. The questions from students were thoughtful and sometimes heartbreaking. One girl asked if it was okay that her uncle never talked about his time in Afghanistan, if his silence meant he was ashamed. Ethan answered with wisdom that seemed beyond his years, explaining that sometimes people carry heavy things inside and need time to figure out how to share them. The silence was not shame, but perhaps sadness for things he had seen or friends he had lost. The best thing she could do was let her uncle know she loved him and was proud of him, and be patient if he needed space. A boy raised his hand and asked a question that made the room go quiet. His father had died in Iraq when he was 3 years old, and he did not remember him at all. He wondered if it was wrong that he could not miss someone he never really knew. Ethan's response was immediate and compassionate. He said that missing someone was not the only way to honor them. Learning about them, understanding what they valued and why they made the choices they made, carrying forward the good things they believed in, these were all ways of keeping someone's memory alive. His great-grandfather had taught him that remembering was active, not passive. It meant choosing to learn their stories and let those stories shape who you became. After the assembly, students lined up to meet Ethan personally. Many shared stories about family members who had served. Some brought photographs from home, showing Ethan pictures of parents, grandparents, siblings, aunts, and uncles in uniform. Each photo represented a story, a life touched by service. Ethan looked at every picture carefully, asking questions about the person, thanking the student for sharing their family's sacrifice. One encounter particularly moved everyone present. A quiet boy named Marcus approached Ethan near the end of the day. He held a Purple Heart medal in his trembling hand, explaining that it had belonged to his grandfather who had died before Marcus was born. His mother kept it in a drawer, unable to look at it without crying, unable to throw it away. Marcus had snuck it out of the house that morning, wanting to show it to Ethan, but terrified he would get in trouble. Ethan asked Marcus to tell him about his grandfather. The boy admitted he knew very little, just that his grandfather had been wounded in Vietnam and died from complications years later. His family never talked about it, treating it like a secret shame rather than a story worth telling. Watching Ethan's video had made Marcus wonder if maybe his grandfather's service was something to be proud of, rather than hidden away. Sarah watched as her son carefully held the Purple Heart, treating it with the reverence it deserved. Ethan told Marcus that his grandfather had been given that medal because he had been wounded while serving his country. It meant he had faced danger to protect others, including people he would never meet, including Marcus, who would not be born for many years. That was not something to hide or be ashamed of. That was bravery and sacrifice, and Marcus should be proud to be his grandson. The conversation continued for several minutes, with Ethan encouraging Marcus to ask his mother to share stories about his grandfather. He suggested that maybe his mother kept the medal in a drawer not because she was ashamed, but because it hurt too much to see it, because it reminded her of everything she had lost. Perhaps Marcus could help her understand that sharing those stories, even the painful ones, could honor his grandfather's memory better than silence. The principal later told Sarah that he had called Marcus's mother to explain what had happened. Instead of being angry about the medal, she had broken down crying and agreed to come to the school the next day to talk with Marcus about his grandfather. The conversation Ethan had started might finally help a family begin healing wounds that had festered for decades. Similar stories emerged from other schools Ethan visited. In rural Tennessee, a teenager who had been planning to drop out decided to finish high school, inspired by Ethan's words about responsibility and service. In California, a group of students organized a project to collect oral histories from local veterans, preserving their stories before they were lost forever. In Massachusetts, an elementary school started a tradition of honoring veterans not just on Veterans Day, but throughout the year, with students learning about different aspects of military service and sacrifice. The impact extended beyond schools. Veterans Affairs hospitals reported increases in visitors, families reaching out to wounded warriors they had previously found too painful to face. Veteran service organizations saw surges in membership and volunteer applications. Military recruiters noted that more young people were asking thoughtful questions about service, approaching it not as a fallback option, but as a calling worthy of serious consideration. Not everyone appreciated Ethan's growing influence. Some critics argued that he was being used to militarize children, to romanticize war and gloss over its terrible costs. Others accused Sarah of exploiting her son for fame and profit, despite her consistent refusal of commercial opportunities. A few suggested that teaching children about military service was a form of indoctrination, inappropriate in a society that should be pursuing peace. Sarah read these criticisms and understood where some of them came from. War was terrible, and military service came with costs that could not be measured or fully comprehended by those who had not experienced them. But she also knew that Ethan was not promoting war or glorifying violence. He was honoring the people who served, recognizing their sacrifice and commitment regardless of how anyone felt about the conflicts they fought in. There was a difference between supporting soldiers and supporting war, between honoring service and promoting militarism. Ethan seemed to understand that distinction instinctively, even if some adults struggled with it. Through it all, Ethan remained remarkably grounded. He still attended his regular school, still played with his friends, still did homework and chores. His room was decorated with the normal interests of a 7-year-old boy: superheroes and dinosaurs and Legos. The flag from Arlington held a place of honor on his bookshelf, next to the photograph Thomas had given him, but they shared space with chapter books and toy cars and collections of rocks he found interesting. Sarah often found him in front of that bookshelf, looking at the photograph of his great-grandfather and Thomas as young soldiers. She would stand quietly in the doorway, watching her son absorb the image, connecting the elderly veteran he had known to the young warrior in muddy fatigues. Sometimes Ethan would talk to the photograph, sharing his day or asking questions he knew. As months passed, the intense media attention gradually faded, replaced by the normal rhythm of life. Ethan returned to being just another student in his third-grade class, though one whose experiences had been extraordinary. His teacher, Mrs. Anderson, noticed subtle changes in him. He had always been thoughtful, but now he possessed a deeper understanding of concepts like sacrifice, duty, and legacy. When they studied history, Ethan connected with the material differently than his peers, seeing not just dates and events but real people making difficult choices. The other children treated him normally, which Sarah had worried might not happen. Kids could be cruel to anyone perceived as different, and Ethan's public profile certainly made him stand out. But his classmates seemed to understand instinctively that Ethan had not sought attention or tried to make himself special. He was the same friend he had always been, willing to share his lunch, help with homework, and laugh at jokes. The fact that he had done something remarkable did not change who he was at his core. What did change was the way veterans and military families approached them in public. It happened frequently, in grocery stores and restaurants, at parks and community events. Someone would recognize Ethan, usually a veteran or family member, and approach to share how his tribute had affected them. These encounters were always respectful, never intrusive, and Sarah appreciated how carefully people navigated the boundary between expressing gratitude and overwhelming her son. One Saturday afternoon at a local diner, an elderly man approached their table hesitantly. He wore a Vietnam veteran's cap and moved slowly, his body bearing the weight of both age and old injuries. He introduced himself as William and asked permission to speak with Ethan. When Sarah nodded, William explained that he had served in Vietnam and returned home to protests and hatred. For decades, he had hidden his service, ashamed of something he had once been proud of, scarred by a nation that blamed soldiers for politicians' decisions. William's voice shook as he told them that watching Ethan's tribute had been the first time in 50 years that he had felt honored for his service rather than condemned for it. Seeing a child understand that soldiers deserved respect regardless of anyone's feelings about the war had cracked something open inside him. He had started attending veteran support groups, something he had refused to do for decades. He had reconnected with old unit members he had cut out of his life. He was beginning to heal from wounds that time alone had not closed. Ethan listened with the attentiveness he gave all veterans, then stood up and offered his hand to shake. The gesture was simple but meaningful, a formal acknowledgement of respect between equals. William took the small hand in his weathered, scarred one, and tears rolled down his face unchecked. He thanked Ethan for giving him back a piece of himself he thought was lost forever, for reminding him that his service had meaning beyond the politics and controversy. After William left, Sarah noticed Ethan was quiet. When she asked what he was thinking, he said he felt sad that Mr. William had felt bad about serving his country for so long. It did not seem fair that soldiers got blamed for wars they did not start. Sarah agreed, explaining that this was one reason why his great-grandfather had taught him to honor the warrior, not the war. The distinction was important, and Ethan was helping people understand it. The recognition Ethan had received also brought opportunities for the family to give back in meaningful ways. They became involved with several veterans organizations, not as celebrity endorsers but as active participants. Ethan volunteered at VA hospitals, visiting with wounded warriors and long-term care patients. He was remarkably good at it, possessing an instinctive understanding of when to talk and when to simply sit quietly with someone. During one hospital visit, he spent an afternoon with a young Marine named Corporal Jackson, who had lost both legs in an IED explosion in Afghanistan. Jackson was struggling with depression, questioning whether his sacrifice had meaning, whether anyone back home cared about what had happened to him. The physical wounds were healing, but the psychological ones remained raw and painful. Ethan sat beside Jackson's wheelchair and told him about his great-grandfather, about the lessons learned during their time together. He explained that his great-grandfather had told him that service was not measured by whether you came home whole or broken, but by whether you had answered the call when your country needed you. Jackson had done that. He had stood up when standing up was hard, had taken responsibility for protecting others, had paid a price that could never be fully compensated. The Marine listened with an expression that gradually shifted from skepticism to something that looked like hope. When Ethan finished, Jackson asked him a direct question. Did he really believe that, or was he just saying what people wanted to hear? Ethan's response was immediate and firm. He believed it completely, and if Jackson wanted proof, he should look at all the letters and messages Ethan received from people thanking him for honoring soldiers like Jackson. People did care. They did appreciate the sacrifice. Sometimes they just did not know how to express it or show it. That conversation marked a turning point for Jackson. His therapist later told Sarah that the Marine had been on the edge of giving up, contemplating dark options. But talking with Ethan had reminded him that his service mattered, that people valued what he had done even if the country sometimes seemed indifferent to veterans' struggles. It gave him a reason to keep fighting, to work through the pain and anger and grief. These stories accumulated over time, each one representing a life touched by Ethan's simple act of honor. A Gold Star mother found the courage to finally visit her son's grave after years of being unable to face it. A veteran struggling with addiction entered treatment after watching Ethan's tribute and realizing he owed it to his fallen brothers to live a life worthy of their sacrifice. A teenager decided to join the military not because he had no other options, but because he wanted to be part of something that served a greater purpose. Sarah documented these stories carefully, saving letters and emails, recording conversations when people gave permission. She wanted Ethan to have a record of the impact his great-grandfather's lessons had created, the ripples spreading outward from one old veteran, teaching one small boy about honor and service. Someday, when Ethan was older, he would be able to look back and see the full scope of what had begun with a simple tribute at a tomb. The first anniversary of Ethan's original visit to Arlington approached with a mix of reflection and anticipation. Various organizations wanted to mark the occasion with ceremonies or events, but Sarah declined most requests. Instead, they planned a quiet, private visit to the cemetery, just the two of them, to lay flowers at both the tomb of the unknown soldier and at Ethan's great-grandfather's grave. They arrived early on a weekday morning when crowds would be minimal. The cemetery was beautiful in the soft morning light, peaceful and serene. As they walked through the rows of white headstones, Ethan noticed more than he had a year earlier. He read names and dates, calculating ages, noting how many had died young. Each marker represented a life cut short, potential unfulfilled, families forever incomplete. At his great-grandfather's grave, Ethan placed flowers carefully at the base of the headstone. He stood at attention and saluted, holding it longer than strictly necessary, making sure his great-grandfather knew he was remembered and honored. Then he sat down in the grass beside the grave and began talking, telling the old veteran about the year that had passed, the people he had met, the stories he had heard. Sarah stood back, giving him space for this private conversation. When they reached the tomb of the unknown soldier, the familiar sentinel was pacing his route, the ritual unbroken and unchanging. Ethan watched for several minutes before approaching to place flowers near the tomb. He did not salute this time, did not recite the creed. The moment did not need those formalities. It was enough to be present, to bear witness, to remember. As they turned to leave, a man in uniform approached them. He introduced himself as Staff Sergeant Miller, explaining that he had been one of the sentinels on duty the day of Ethan's original tribute. He had since completed his rotation at the tomb and was now serving elsewhere. But he had returned to Arlington specifically hoping to meet Ethan on this anniversary. Miller told them that guarding the tomb was the highest honor of his military career, a responsibility he took with absolute seriousness. Every step, every turn, every moment of his watch was dedicated to ensuring that the unknown soldier was never forgotten or alone. But he admitted that after months of repetition, it was easy to lose sight of why the ritual mattered, to focus on perfection of execution rather than purpose of mission. Ethan's tribute had reminded him and every other sentinel why they stood watch. It was not about the routine itself, but about what it represented. An unbroken promise that service and sacrifice would be honored, that those who gave everything would be remembered. Watching a 7-year-old understand and embody that truth had renewed Miller's sense of purpose, had carried him through the rest of his rotation with a deeper appreciation for the mission. The three of them stood together for a while, watching the current sentinel march his route. Then Miller rendered a sharp salute to Ethan, which the boy, 6 months after the initial tribute at Arlington, Sarah received an email that made her hands shake as she read it. The message came from the Department of Defense, specifically from the office coordinating a major ceremony planned for Memorial Day. They wanted to invite Ethan to participate in the national observance at Arlington National Cemetery, an event that would be attended by the president, high-ranking military officials, and broadcast live across the country. His role would be simple but profound: to lay a wreath at the tomb of the unknown soldier on behalf of America's children. Sarah spent a sleepless night considering the request. This would be different from anything Ethan had done before. The scale was enormous, the scrutiny intense, the pressure immense. She worried about putting that weight on such young shoulders, about exposing him to criticism and attention that could overshadow the sincerity of his tribute. But she also recognized the honor being offered, the opportunity for Ethan to speak for an entire generation of children who wanted to honor those who served, but rarely had their voices heard. The next morning, she sat down with Ethan and explained the invitation. She made it clear that the choice was his, that saying no was perfectly acceptable and nothing to feel guilty about. She described what the ceremony would involve: the crowds and cameras, the pressure to perform perfectly in front of millions of watching eyes. She wanted him to understand fully what he would be agreeing to. Ethan listened quietly, his expression thoughtful. After a long pause, he asked a question that revealed the depth of his understanding. He wanted to know if doing this would help people remember soldiers and be thankful for them, the way his tribute at the tomb had. When Sarah confirmed that it would, that his participation could inspire millions to think about service and sacrifice, Ethan's decision was immediate. He would do it, not because he wanted attention, but because his great-grandfather had taught him that when you had an opportunity to do something good, you took it. The weeks leading up to Memorial Day were filled with preparation. Ethan practiced the formal procedures for wreath-laying under the guidance of military protocol officers. He learned about the history of Memorial Day, about how it had begun after the Civil War as Decoration Day, when people placed flowers on the graves of fallen soldiers, both Union and Confederate. He studied the significance of the tomb of the unknown soldier, representing all those who had died in service, but whose remains were never identified or never recovered. Sarah watched her son absorb all this information with the same seriousness he brought to everything related to service and honor, but she also made sure he had time to be a normal child. They went to the movies, played in the park, had dinner with friends. She wanted him to understand that while what he was doing was important, it did not define him entirely. He was still Ethan, still 7 years old, still allowed to play and laugh and occasionally complain about eating vegetables. Memorial Day arrived with perfect weather, the sky a brilliant blue without a single cloud. Arlington National Cemetery had been transformed for the occasion, with additional seating areas set up to accommodate the thousands who would attend in person. Television crews positioned their cameras at strategic locations, preparing to broadcast the ceremony to millions more watching from home, from military bases overseas, from hospital rooms where wounded warriors recovered. Ethan wore a new suit that Sarah had purchased for the occasion, dark and formal but sized for a child. She had pinned a small photograph of his great-grandfather inside the jacket, over his heart, so that the old veteran would be with him during this moment. Ethan had touched the photograph frequently that morning, drawing strength from the connection it represented. They arrived early, escorted through security checkpoints by military personnel who treated them with a respect that still surprised Sarah. Behind the scenes, Ethan met some of the other participants in the ceremony, including generals whose chests were covered with ribbons and medals, politicians who wielded significant power, and celebrities who had come to honor the fallen. Yet Ethan was treated not as a curiosity, but as an equal participant, someone whose role was as important as anyone else's. A young soldier named Private First Class Jennifer Rodriguez was assigned to guide Ethan through the ceremony's logistics. She was barely 20 years old, having joined the Army straight out of high school. As they walked through the procedures one final time, Jennifer shared that she had watched Ethan's original video during basic training. On a particularly difficult day when she had questioned her decision to enlist, watching a child understand and honor the commitment she was making had reminded her why she had raised her hand and taken the oath. His tribute had helped her push through doubt and complete her training. The ceremony began with the playing of the national anthem, the notes crisp and clear in the morning air. Ethan stood at attention, hand over heart, maintaining perfect stillness throughout. He had learned this from his great-grandfather, who had insisted that when the anthem played, everything else stopped. It was a moment to remember what the song represented, the battles fought and lives lost to preserve the freedom it celebrated. Various speakers took the podium, their words eloquent and moving. They talked about the cost of freedom, about the debt owed to those who had fallen in service, about the importance of remembering not just on one day but throughout the year. Veterans in the audience listened with expressions that mixed pride with pain, remembering comrades who had not made it home, thinking about the empty chairs at family gatherings, the birthdays and anniversaries celebrated without loved ones who existed now only in memory. When the time came for the wreath-laying, Ethan walked forward with measured steps. The wreath was large and heavy, held by 2 military personnel who would assist him in placing it at the tomb. But Ethan carried himself with a dignity that transcended his small size. He did not look nervous or overwhelmed. Instead, he appeared focused, aware that he was acting not just for himself but for every child who had lost a parent, sibling, or family member to war, for every young person who wanted to honor service and sacrifice but did not know how. The sentinel guarding the tomb continued his march as Ethan approached, the ritual unbroken by ceremony or crowds. 21 steps, turn 21 seconds facing the tomb, turn 21 steps back. The precision was hypnotic, a physical manifestation of unwavering commitment. As Ethan and his escorts positioned the wreath on its stand before the tomb, the sentinel completed his count, turned, and for the briefest moment, his eyes met Ethan's across the sacred space. In that instant, something passed between them that cameras could not fully capture, and words could not adequately describe. It was recognition, respect, an acknowledgement of shared purpose despite the vast differences in age and experience. The Sentinel had devoted himself to guarding the tomb, to ensuring that the unknown soldier was never alone. Ethan, in his own way, had committed himself to ensuring that no soldier was forgotten, that service and sacrifice remained valued and honored. They were different expressions of the same core truth. Some debts could never be fully repaid, but they should never be forgotten. Ethan stepped back and brought his hand up in salute. The motion was perfect, crisp, and controlled, executed with all the precision his great-grandfather had taught him. He held it for several seconds, standing absolutely still, his small silhouette outlined against the white marble of the tomb. The assembled crowd of thousands fell into complete silence, the weight of the moment pressing down on everyone present. Then, in an echo of what had happened 6 months earlier, the Sentinel returned the salute. This time it was not subtle or questionable. It was full and formal, a soldier's acknowledgement rendered to another guardian of memory. The gesture lasted only a few seconds, but its impact rippled through every person who witnessed it. Some observers wept openly. Others stood with hands pressed to mouths, overwhelmed by emotion. Veterans in the crowd came to attention, many rendering their own salutes in a spontaneous show of unity and respect. When Ethan lowered his hand and turned to walk back to his seat, he found himself facing not just his mother, but an entire nation standing in tribute. The applause began slowly, building gradually into a thunderous wave of sound that seemed to shake the very ground. But it was not celebration. It was gratitude, recognition, a collective acknowledgement that this child had reminded them of something essential and true. As Ethan sat down beside Sarah, she wrapped her arm around him and felt him lean into her embrace. He was trembling slightly now, the weight of what he had just done finally settling over him. Sarah whispered that his great-grandfather would be so proud, that he had honored not just one soldier but all of them, that he had done something truly important. Ethan nodded against her shoulder, his eyes bright with unshed tears. The ceremony continued with more speakers and musical performances, but for many in attendance, nothing would match the power of watching a 7-year-old boy honor the fallen with such pure sincerity. News coverage that evening led with images of Ethan at the tomb, his small hand raised in salute. Commentators from across the political spectrum praised the moment as a reminder of shared values in a time of division. In living rooms across America, family,